How's everybody going this evening? I'm Christian Wagner, and this is Militant Thomist. And today I'm with Dr. Jack Kilcrease. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, your background, how you're interested in Lutheran Christology.
Yeah, I'm a Lutheran theologian and historian of Christian doctrine. I teach at the Institute of Lutheran Theology as associate professor of historical and systematic theology, and I've written my own sort of systematic Christology. I've written on other subjects like justification and the authority of Scripture and things of this nature. And Christology is a really kind of strong controlling kind of interest for me. So I'm always interested in having conversations about this, particularly from the perspective of my own tradition.
So how much, because this will eventually later in the stream take a polemical tone a bit,
Okay.
but how much are you interested in the debates between Roman Catholics and Lutherans, and then Reformed and Lutherans on the subject of Christology? Has that been a
No,
research
yeah, I mean,
interest of yours?
I've dealt with that. Yeah, I mean, in my Christology book, I've dealt with that quite extensively, and so.
Okay, so for the listeners out there that aren't too familiar with a nice systematic Christology, will you give us a bit of a baseline to work off of that all of the Protestants, Orthodox, Catholics are going to agree upon those points of agreement we have?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the basic agreement across the traditions of mainstream Christianity would be encompassed, I would say, in the first 6 ecumenical councils. And the first 6 ecumenical councils affirm that Jesus is true God, sharing divinity with the Father and the Spirit, and true man, sharing humanity with everybody, all the rest of us, right? That he, though, nevertheless is a single person, meaning he's a single center of identity, I guess is how I would put it. That's what I think more the ancient term hypostatus means, more than like personality or something like that. I mean, it's more a center of identity, who acts then through the two natures. So persons are agents and they act through natures, essentially. And then the implication of that is that his mother, Mary, is indeed the mother of God, because as a single subject, anything that happens to him as man obviously can be predicated to him as a divine person. So she is the mother of God. She's not the mother of divinity. She doesn't generate the divine substance of something of that nature, but she is his mother and he is God. So she is the mother of God. It's the third ecumenical council. And then the fifth and sixth are sort of more fine tuning of this. The problem that you have with facing people after the fourth ecumenical council, where it's affirmed that Jesus is one person but two natures, is that typically natures have person. So wouldn't he then be two persons, right? So the argument is, and this is again very sort of technical and obscure, that his humanity is what's called anhypostatic, meaning it has all the components of humanity and has a hypostatus, but it doesn't have a hypostatus within itself. It is a person within itself. It rather participates in and is incorporated into the already existing person of the second person of the Trinity. That's how the man Jesus, to get it more concrete, that's how the man Jesus can say things like, "Give me, Father, give me glory that I had with you before the foundation of the world." Well, is that the man Jesus? Did Jesus exist before the foundation of the world? Well, no. He is talking in his person, which is the second person of the Trinity, and his human nature is incorporated into that, right? So the center of identity of the human nature is the divine person. And then finally, because Christ is complete in two natures, he has a divine will and a human will. That's the sixth ecumenical council. Not because he's some sort of two-headed monster competing with two centers of identity competing with each other, but rather that will is a component of human nature and it's a component of divine nature, and he would not be fully human or fully divine if he didn't have two wills. Incidentally, they're in total harmony with one another, and his single divine person acts through his distinct wills as it acts through his distinct natures. So he's not a disunited person as a result of this. But nevertheless, he has all the components of both human and divine nature, meaning he must necessarily then have two wills, right?
Yes.
And
So
I
that
think we
was
all agree on that.
you can go ahead if you
No,
have
I was just
something.
saying, I think that we would all agree on that. So Thomas Aquinas would agree with that.
Yes.
John Calvin would agree with that, and the Lutherans would agree with all those things. So
Okay, so let's get into those distinctively Lutheran aspects. And it is my understanding, at least, I've done an okay amount of reading on this topic for a few papers I wrote in undergrad.
right.
But it's my understanding that there's distinctive schools of Lutheran thought that
Yes.
there are. So give us the confessional view, and then some other kind of branches where there's some deeper speculation that goes off from that.
Okay. Right. Okay. So really, kind of the different schools kind of arise in the interim between Luther dying and then the Formula of Concord getting written. So Luther, the distinctive argument that Luther makes is he takes things. His argument is, okay, if Christ is two natures and he's always God and man all the time, everywhere, then it logically follows, says Luther, that um, um, the human nature is present everywhere in some kind of mysterious sense, not in the sense that like he's multiplied like infinitely or something like that. Like there's an infinite number of the man Jesus is filling up all around us or something like that. But in some mysterious sense, the human nature is everywhere because if you said, okay, well, here's divinity but not humanity, then you'd be dividing the natures. Okay, if you just said that he was God and man in the circumscribed position of the man Jesus, but not everywhere else he just hummed along as a fleshless God, then Luther says then you're dividing the two natures. And this is possible for Luther because of his distinct understanding of what's called the communicatio idiomatum, which means the communication of attributes between the two natures. So a corollary of Christ being united as true man and true God, or true God and true man, that would be a better way of putting it, is that there's a sharing of attributes between them, between the two natures, not in the sense that one nature is transmuted into the other, but in the sense that they participate in the realities of the other, in the same way that, for example, your soul and your body are different from one another. But when your soul is in your body becomes animated. When your soul is removed from your body, the characteristics of the soul, which is animation, are removed, and then you fall over into a pile of dead matter, essentially, right? So there's a sharing of the divine attributes, Luther says, with the human nature by participation, not by transmutation. In the same way, he doesn't use this analogy, but later Lutherans will borrow an analogy that some of the Greek fathers used, which was when you put a piece of metal in the fire, it doesn't turn the piece of metal into fire, but it glows with the fire within it, I guess you could say. It's heated. And this in part is also how he explains the idea of the right hand of God. So the right hand of God, there's no semi-local heaven, okay? The right hand of God is, since God doesn't obviously sit on a throne, it's God's power and glory, and God's power and glory are everywhere. So Jesus, the man Jesus, therefore has to, in some mysterious sense, be everywhere. And this also then connects with his argument in favor of Eucharistic presence. He says, I don't know how Christ gets into the Eucharist, but we already know he's present everywhere, according to divinity and humanity. So maybe that's how God gets him in there. Okay. I don't know how he does it, but that could be the way, because God could do it a whole bunch of different ways, but maybe that's it. So that was an argument he used against Ulrich Zwingli and some of the Southern kind of proto-reformed reformers who, like Ecolampadius as well, who wanted to say, well, the two natures don't really communicate with each other in any manner other than maybe verbally. We might say he's one person. So it's kind of when you glue two boards together, and you could say that there's some characteristics of one kind of wood and one characteristics of the other kind of wood in the boards glued together, but really they don't communicate with each other in the same way that, like, the analogy with like fire and metal or something like that.
Can
And
this
so,
be can this be taken analogously to how we would understand theosis? That there is this certain divinization of us
oh
and our
yes, yes,
participation with the Spirit in union with Christ, and that
yeah,
in Christ this grace of union is held
yes,
par excellence because there's no what's the word I'm thinking of? There's no barriers put in the way of it through of
right.
sin and
Mhm.
of
Well,
flesh,
and
and
the idea
it's
of
just a
mystical
very
union.
intimate union.
Mhm. The idea of mystical union is really important in later Lutheranism, and in Luther, and they even appropriate the language of theosis. People like Johann Gerhard will quote the patristic adage about God becoming man, that man becomes divine, and things like this. Um, anyways, the Reformed, the early Reformed, which are different from Calvinists, but the early Reformed wanted to say there's no communication, and heaven is this location that kind of outside the solar system, and so Jesus's body would have to come whizzing past the planets to get onto the altar every Sunday, and so that would make it not a body, right? Because
Yeah.
we'd eat them all up essentially over 2,000 years, and so it's just a symbol essentially. That was so. So Luther was very, very concerned with rejecting that idea. Um, and when he dies, though, it moves into some different and kind of interesting phases. Um, so there ends up being two traditions that kind of emerge. One tradition is by another Lutheran reformer in southern Germany, in Swabia, where actually my ancestors come from, named Johannes Brent or Brentius. That's his name. But and that one really took Luther's ideas about the communication of the divinity to the humanity to 11, so to speak. Brentius's idea was that the humanity participated in all the attributes of the divinity, with the exception of being uncreated. He didn't want to think that somehow that humanity was sort of absorbed into the divinity, okay, or became kind of some kind of hybrid. He was actually concerned about kind of guarding against a kind of Eutychianism at that point, not least because Luther had a late opponent called Caspar Zwenkfeld, who did quite literally want to argue that humanity was absorbed into the divinity and actually promote a kind of Eutychianism. And Luther actually kind of swings back in the opposite direction of trying to emphasize the duality of the two natures in some of his very, very late Christological disputations that are just actually being translated now. But Brentius, I mean, he's in very close proximity to the Southern Reformers, and so this is really important to him, particularly in terms of the Eucharistic doctrine. So he wants to say all the divine attributes are communicated to the human nature. And how then does the human nature possess them? Well, the human nature possesses them accidentally. So they're accidents. He wants to use this language from Aristotelianism that they are that the human nature is a subject of which the divine nature's attributes become predicates. And he wants to argue very oddly, from the perspective of later Lutheranism, that in fact being circumscribed to a specific location is only an accidental quality on human nature. And so human nature actually could literally be omnipresent and not somehow cease to be human, which again comes rather perilously close, I think, to kind of Eutychianism without maybe going over the line. So that was one direction people went. And Brentius, he was geographically far away from Luther, and he was Lutheran, but he had definitely his own ideas. The other end of the spectrum, Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's co-reformer, never really bought into the omnipresence of Christ's human nature. He did agree with the idea of the divine attributes being communicated to the human nature, though early on, and gradually seems to have kind of abandoned it. But he had a number of students who were more loyal to Luther, who then were in agreement with this early position, but kind of wanted to moderate Luther's position. And among these would be Martin Chemnitz and a guy named Tillemann Jesusius, who actually lived in Heidelberg and kind of spent a lot of time brawling with the Reformed people down there. And their positions are sort of more they're closer to the Reformed position and a little bit farther away from Luther's position, but they still hold some of the premises of Luther's position. In the case of Chemnitz, he wanted to divide up the Communicatio Idiomatum into three genera, called, that is to say, three sort of categories of communication. So the first category was called the genus idiomaticum. And the genus idiomaticum is that all the attributes of divinity and humanity can be attributed to the person when considered in what he called the concrete. So he distinguishes between what's called the concrete and then the abstract. This is a distinction, I think, that, well, it goes back to high scholasticism, but I think it was Bonaventura who came up with this, the first person. But the concrete means in the concrete unity of the person, as we look as we examine Jesus as he is concretely, as divine and human in one person, versus the abstract, which would be just sort of looking at what the divinity is in itself, or looking at what the humanity is in itself, abstracted from the hypostatic union, right? So
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this kind of sounds a bit, I was reading St. John Henry Newman. He's referring back to certain of the neo-scholastics, and in the medieval church too, in the Thomistic school, and going all the way back to the agnoete in the early church, those that denied Christ's, those who affirmed Christ's ignorance of what humans may know. And they make this distinction between first and second act, that Christ was ignorant in his human nature, but Christ was not
Right.
ignorant from his human nature. Is this a similar idea of what he's getting at?
Ignorant from his human nature, but not in his human nature. Well, I mean, okay, so if you're going to deal with, for example, let's say Christ not knowing things in a state of humiliation, if you're going to talk about the in the concrete, you could say that Christ had all knowledge, since you could say that he had it as God, though I guess you could say that he didn't have it as man, right, or something like that. But if you abstracted the human nature and the divine nature, you could say that he had it all as God, but then he didn't have it as man, or something along those lines. I guess is that kind of what you're getting at? I mean, I guess I'm
because the distinction between first and second act is going to be that there's a certain communication which goes on, whereby in the theosis which happens, that there is an illumining with the lumen gratia, with that light of grace, illumining with the beatific vision itself, even to the human mind of Christ, something which isn't naturally inherent, but something which is communicated from the divinity to the humanity. And
I see
like that's kind of what's getting at.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So you could consider, yes, Christ as just what substantially he is as a human, right? Or you can consider him from the perspective of what is right, and that would be, we might say, in the abstract. Okay. So, or you can consider him in the unity, what he's also then getting as from his divine. I get what you're getting at, but yes, that would be correct, I think. So, right. So the genus idiomaticum, that would be that all divine and human attributes are attributed to the person of Christ in the concrete. So we're talking about the concrete here, the concrete unity of the hypostatic union. Then the second one is called the genus epithelestematicum, which is a mouthful. And that means that all acts in the concrete, right, can be attributed to the divine human person, right? So it's possible to say, and the New Testament does say this, God, you killed God, or the word of glory was crucified, or this man created the world. Okay. This doesn't mean, of course, that would not apply to the abstract, of course, because as God can't die, of course, just like human the humanity of Christ was not present at the creation of the world, but because in the concrete unity, Christ is one person, the one person did these things, and so whatever happens to one nature can be attributed to the other in the concrete unity. So it is appropriate, again, to reiterate, to call Mary the Mother of God, right? Because, in fact, the New Testament says she's the mother of my Lord, and the Lord is just not a polite title in that context when she's talking to Elizabeth, or Elizabeth is talking to her, rather. So she is the mother of God, again, not because she generates divinity, but because she is the mother of the subject, Jesus Christ, who is true God and true man. So now the last one is then the most controversial one, which says, in the abstract, that is to say, considered in itself, the attributes of divinity are communicated to humanity. Now, does this mean then that the humanity is somehow transmuted into divinity? That is not the case, no. The humanity of Christ shares in the attributes of divinity by participation. It's deified by participation. Its essential attributes are not altered. Would that not lead us to say that it would be more appropriate to say that in the abstract it does not share the attributes of divinity? Well, Chemnitz would say no, because of the anhypostatic nature of the humanity of Christ. Even when you're considering the humanity of Christ in the abstract, you're considering it as the human nature of the Logos, who is in union with it, right? So really, in a sense, even when you're considering the human nature in the abstract, you're considering it in the concrete, right? So now Hessusius, who was similar to Chemnitz, he got nervous about this. He didn't like that very much. And so he said, no, when we talk about the abstract, we're only really talking about the essential attributes of a nature. And so we couldn't really say that. But nevertheless, this is more of a verbal distinction. Later Lutherans realized that there's really not any difference between his position and Chemnitz's position. It's just as a matter of how you're going to use terminology. In the case of both Hessusius and then Chemnitz, they reject Luther's idea that Christ is, and Brentius's idea that Christ is omnipresent according to his human nature. What they say is that he's potentially omnipresent according to his human nature. This is what's referred to as the multi-voli presence. So Jesus is always with his church, because he says, as true God and true man, because he says, lo, I'm with you to the end of the age. Okay. He can be present in the sacraments whenever he wants to be, but he isn't necessarily present everywhere. He's present when and where he wants to be, right? Because the humanity is united with the divinity and therefore shares in the possibilities of the divinity, and which means also the possibility of being many places at once in some kind of mysterious sense that we can't really talk about or explain. And so that was a much more sort of moderate position. And people in northern Germany and Saxony ended up kind of taking that position. And people in sort of southwestern Germany, the Lutherans in southwestern Germany, ended up kind of taking the position more like with Brentius and closer to Luther's position. Jakob Andrer, who ended up writing the Formula of Concord with Chemnitz, took a position more refined, but very similar to Brentius's position. Now, how does it work out that in the Formula of Concord? Well, the Formula of Concord explicitly affirms Chemnitz's three genera that I just discussed. There's a debate about whether it affirms the absolute omnipresence of Christ's human nature. It definitely repeatedly says that Christ can be present wherever he wants to be. So some people have taken that to mean that Chemnitz's position ends up actually winning out, even if many later Lutherans don't necessarily interpret the Formula of Concord that way. So there was a guy named Franz von Franck who wrote a book in the 1860s called The Theology of the Formula of Concord, that was his interpretation. So that was in German Lutheranism, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That was a very influential interpretation. Other people in my denominational tradition typically read the Formula of Concord as affirming the absolute omnipresence of Christ's human nature in accordance with Luther's position. The reason for that is that it also then, even though it in terms of its own confessional statements, it repeatedly says he can, not that necessarily is, but that he can. It quotes Luther repeatedly on this point, and statements of Luther that affirm the absolute omnipresence. And in one case, that stating, of course, his logic that you would be dividing the two natures if you denied the absolute omnipresence of Christ's human nature, right? So, and indeed, Jesusius later on, when asked to sign the Formula of Concord, says, "I can't sign this thing. It affirms the absolute omnipresence of Christ's human nature." So people definitely interpreted it that way at the time. Other positions, a third position might be Edmund Schlink's position in his book, The Theology of Lutheran Confessions, as a 20th century Lutheran theologian. And his interpretation is that they don't even bother trying to reconcile them. They just add language that affirms both positions and then just sort of hope everybody can read it the way they want to. I don't know that's a very satisfying response myself, not one I agree with either, but nevertheless, that's his position. So in any case.
So can you, unless you have anything else to add, do you have
No,
anything
I
else
don't
to
know.
add?
That's just the basic thing, Christology. Right?
So can you tell me about the term ubiquitarian? Yeah, I think it would be ubiquitarian. I've only read it. Yes, I've only read it because when you're reading Roman Catholic sources and Reformed sources, you'll get this term used against Lutherans.
Yeah, that's us. Okay. So sometimes the doctrine of the absolute omnipresence of Christ is called ubiquity, but that's not really a good term for it because that makes it sound like Christ's humanity is somehow spatially extended, which is not what Luther means at all. One important idea that he takes from late medieval scholasticism is the idea of multiple modes of presence. And there's in Ockhamism, there was essentially three modes of presence. There was, and Aquinas uses, I mean, this is not just Occam, Aquinas uses a very similar kind of reasoning to this as well. There's circumscribed presence, which would be, I'm just here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, circumscribed in this location as a concrete entity. Then there is definitive presence. Definitive presence is how a soul is in a body. Does it take up space? Well, no, but it's in my body and not yours, right? So it's a kind of presence, but a presence that doesn't take up space per se. I think Aquinas uses a different term, but he does have the same concept where he talks about how an angel is in a house, right? Does an angel take up space? Well, not really, but he's in your house and not in somebody else's house, right? So, and then there is what's called repletive presence, and repletive presence is a kind of mysterious omnipresence that divinity has, right? Where it can be present anywhere. Some later Lutheran theologians also add a kind of a sacramental presence, a kind of fourth mode of presence. And Luther made it very clear that when he talked about Christ's human nature being omnipresent, he didn't mean it in the sense that his circumscribed presence was infinitely multiplied. That would be ubiquity, but rather that in some kind of mysterious supernatural sense that Christ the man shared the repletive presence of God. He that descended ascended that he might fill all things. No one has ascended except for he that descended, the Son of Man, who's even now in heaven, right? So he would quote verses like these to argue in favor of that position. Also talk about how Christ was present in different modes to the disciples after the resurrection. Right. I mean, walking through walls and appearing and disappearing. Well, Eck, I believe even the Catholic camp, Eck brought up that when he was attacking Zwingli as well. So Catholics have made that observation as well, that there's multiple modes of presence, so that when we receive the Eucharist, certainly we're receiving the substantial body and blood of Christ, but it's not like I say, well, I'll take an arm and you take a leg or something like that. That would be kind of circumscribed presence, right? So.
Have you read Bellarmine and his work on Christ?
No, I haven't actually.
There's actually a 50-page section against the Ubiquitarians, but I haven't read it yet. I had the book.
I should say in Gerhard, I've read him quoted extensively in response to the Lutherans, right? So because Gerhard is, and every single page is responding to Bellarmine. So
Yeah, I think there might have been a little bit of misunderstanding
Oh yes,
going on,
I,
or at least that, because I
mm,
mean during Bellarmine's time, at least there wasn't as hard and fast confessional confessional enforcement as we would like there to be, and there
mhm,
was still some fringe groups being smashed within the various Protestant kingdoms. So,
mhm,
how would you? So, the argument that I usually get, there's two of them against Lutheranism, is
right.
that first the extra Calvinisticum, so the infinite, I mean the finite cannot contain the infinite.
Mhm.
So, what is your general response to that?
The finite cannot contain the infinite. Well, I mean, one, that's not in the Bible. It's from Neoplatonism. But I would say if I mean, just on the level of reason, I mean, um, I mean, if something is infinite, it obviously contains infinite possibilities. One of which would seem to me to be born by the finite, right? So, um, uh, uh, Gustav Allein was a Swedish theologian, Lutheran theologian, 20th century. He said actually it would be better to say that the infinite was capable of the finite then. So that would kind of be my response. I would also say, I mean, there are, I mean, scriptural texts. I mean, like the fullness of the Godhead dwells in him bodily. I mean, what do you mean by that? I mean, in him that dwells the all the treasures and the wisdom of God. I mean, like, what do we refer? What's that referring to? I mean, so I mean, in some mysterious sense, yes. I mean, the finite is capable of the infinite. I mean, the infinite God contains within himself infinite possibilities, including right, in the finite. And the finite and the infinite are not actually opposed to one another. God made his creation to be the vehicle of his infinite goodness. And so actually in that sense, insofar as Christ, or in that Christ is the vehicle of the infinite God, he's actually fulfilling the supreme goal of what it means to be a creature, to receive all of God's infinite goodness within yourself, right, through mystical union. So,
So the second argument is going to be that this goes against this makes the term human nature, or a certain set of attributes predicable to a subject,
mhm,
that makes the fact of a human nature to be completely null and utterly insane, to say that it's essential to having humanness,
mhm,
that one in a certain mode is finite, or has a certain uh, local presence that is
mhm.
constrained in a
Sure.
certain area. So how would you go against that argument that's brought up?
I mean, well, there's a couple of easy ways. I mean, one way is just to point out the resurrection narratives, and obviously, Christ has a glorified human nature that isn't constrained, and he doesn't cease to be human. Okay, but he's not restrained to the normal categories of time and space. And the Reformed did genuinely feel the weight of all this, which is why, you know. If you read Calvin's Institutes, he'll make really weird arguments like because in Matthew, like the earthquake happens and the angel rolls away the stone, and then Jesus is already gone. And, okay, well, how did that happen, right? If he's constrained to the, and so Calvin says that the stone was rolled away a few hours earlier. Jesus kind of ran out, and then the angel covered it back up. Um,
It's like how liberal theologians read the miracle accounts.
right, yeah,
The disciples
or
were giving them bread outside, and it was just about
right, yes,
sharing.
right, yeah, Paulinus, yeah, or with Zwingli, I mean, with appearing with the disciples when the doors are all locked, and he says like he kind of made like a hole in the wall, and then like covered it up again with the supernatural power or something. When my wife, she attended Calvin College, she said that they said that the going theory was that he supernaturally created a key so he could open the door to the disciples. I mean, none of this is in the Bible at all. But I mean, yeah, I mean, so obviously, and that doesn't negate him being human. It just means that he's glorified in the way that we'll be glorified in the resurrection as well. I mean, that's the fulfillment of human nature. It's not a negation of human nature. The other points that I would make is that your people are sort of using preconceptions of what human nature is capable of and what it's not capable of. You're letting essentially, what you might say, philosophical definitions of what it means to be substantially human to inform how you read revelation, essentially, which again is necessary and useful to an extent. But on the other hand, when it means that you're going to have to start chopping up text to make them fit these categories you're using, then that becomes, I think, a bit problematic. This is why Luther, in some of his later disputations on Christology and then also the Trinity, which are really fascinating, he talks about what's called the new language of faith. He says that like God takes up our words and then gives us a kind of new language of faith, so that words that have sort of normal philosophical meanings get redefined when they're used in theology. He says, so for example, in philosophy, if you read Aristotle, he says, how Aristotle defines being human, how he defines being God is perfectly useful, but it doesn't really work when you talk about the incarnation, because by definition, God isn't man and man isn't God, right? So, but then God creates a new situation. He does something surprising. He becomes human. So now, in the language of theology, humans can be God and God can be humans, right? So can be human, right? So the vocabulary gets redefined, and what it means to be human gets redefined over what it meant, let's say, within we might use the term language game of philosophy or any other academic discipline, right? So I think that's actually a very interesting and kind of sophisticated way of dealing with it. So
Okay. So everybody listening right now, if you have any questions, send them in the chat now. I'm gonna have a few more things that I want to go over, and then we'll get to questions. So, where I wrote it. Okay, so do you believe, because I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable with Lutheran Christology as we're going on this conversation. So do you believe that the Lutheran reading of the Fathers is a more satisfying reading than the Reformed reading of the Fathers when it comes to Christology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the early church, there's a lot of different trajectories of tradition. I think that the Reformed, in some sense, can see greater continuity with the Latin tradition, though I think that they take some of the ideas in it to the extreme. Obviously, well, I mean, I guess that this is how I read it. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but it seems to me that going back to Leo, or even some of the North African fathers, that there's more of an emphasis in the Latin tradition on the duality of the two natures. Now, for them, of course, that doesn't exclude the real presence by any stretch of the imagination. But there's still this greater, I think, emphasis. If you read just like the Tome of Leo, like he likes to divvy up like what Jesus is doing as God and man and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There's greater emphasis.
He talks about in accordance to one form, then in accordance to the other form, there's the actions happening.
Right. So, so I think that the Reformed people can say, well, okay, I can see them as being in that trajectory, but then taking it kind of in a direction that the Latin tradition would, I don't think that like Leo or any of them would ever really want to take it. I think Lutherans can claim continuity with people like Cyril, but especially in the way that he talks about the communication of attributes, or just even the suffering of God in Christ, the kind of the Theopaside formula, which again is another big emphasis. I mean, Reformed people oftentimes complain about Luther and the Lutheran tradition deifying the human nature of Christ, but it really runs both ways. I mean, Luther is also then very much into saying God really is in our sin and our degradation, like in solidarity with us. Like, it's not like Jesus is going around walking 10 feet off the ground or something. He's really suffering along. Through him, God is really suffering with us, right? So, and with Cyril too, I'm thinking of I think it's the 12th anathema against Nestorius. Like, that's something he emphasizes, that although he's a classical theist, of course, as Luther is, that the divine nature doesn't suffer when you consider it in the abstract, but as Cyril says, it suffers hypostatically, right? So in other words, the person of Christ generally does suffer human nature. And I think you can see that continuity, though again, what Luther does with it and what Cyril does with it are a tad bit different. I mean, in both their cases, there is an emphasis on mystical union, particularly in Cyril's writings on the Gospel of John, which is he very much ties his Christology to kind of Eucharistic piety. That it's by consuming Christ's deified body that we ourselves are, in some sense, deified. The emphasis in Luther is on mystical union, but the mystical union is less absorbing divinity into ourselves, though that seems to actually be an element in Lutheranism. But it's more on the surety of the promise, that if God himself is literally physically giving himself to you, you can't be any more certain of the promise than if that's happening, essentially. The interesting thing I find is that what I've read in a number of historians of the early church is that the takeaway that people had in terms of Cyril's Christology was to emphasize, since humanity could bear divinity, to really kind of increase Marian piety and also the veneration of the saints. Whereas for Luther, it kind of ends up running the opposite direction. Not to say he denigrated Mary or anything like that, but he had a very high Mariology, actually. But of course, that means that Christ, the takeaway is essentially the opposite, namely that Christ is this absolutely unique mediator, and that you should, certainly admire the saints as great people, but not, venerate them or anything like that, and at least not in the sense of historic Orthodox or Roman Catholic piety. So it's interesting how they end up going in kind of different directions with the same premises. So,
okay, so there's oftentimes this discourse can get a bit heated,
right?
And there'll be charges against Lutherans that they're a bunch of dirty Monophysites.
Sure.
There'll be charges against Nestorians, Reformed, that they're a bunch of dirty Nestorians. Do you think there's any weight to this, or do you think that any such charges should just be left for the true heretics?
I think it's a little unfair. I mean, I don't agree with Reformed Christology. I think it's rather unfair to say that they're Nestorians. I think Zwingli is pretty close, but I think that it's not really very fair to Calvin. Calvin has a completely, as far as Chalcedon, as I understand it, goes, it seems to me that Calvin that falls within a range of possible Chalcedonian positions. As a Lutheran, I would say that he doesn't then draw the appropriate inferences from that. The mistake is that he doesn't draw out the logical conclusions from that, which to me would seem to be the Lutheran understanding of the communication of attributes. But I see that as just a limitation of the position. I wouldn't say that he is somehow denying the unity of the two natures or something like that. I mean, I don't think that's very fair to Calvin. I don't think it's fair to call Lutherans Monophysites because there is an understanding of the Communicatio Idiomatum, which I don't see as being any different than most of the Greek fathers. I mean, it's just a more refined statement of it. Of course, you do have the absolute omnipresence, which I think is, as far as I can tell, is not really something that I can know anybody else arguing in favor of prior to Luther, but I think it's the logical conclusion of a certain understanding of the Communicatio Idiomatum, as well as the reality of the possibility of multiple presences, which the scholastics already had established in their disputes about the Eucharist. So I think that though it may be a new development, it's a development in continuity with the stream of the earlier tradition, and I don't think it warrants the claims of monophysitism. Tripping over the words, but yeah.
So what I found to be very interesting is that I believe, at least, I'm interested to see what you think, is that iconography, not even just speaking about the veneration of icons, but strictly the difference between the Lutherans and the Reformed when it comes to the making of images of Christ, is that it's really odd that it did go the way it did, because the Reformed, their fundamental argument is that you can't image God. And so do you have any thoughts on that difference between the Lutherans and the
Oh,
Reformed?
yes. Well, I think, and it's a very good thing you brought it up, because I think it does say a lot about uh, Christology and the trajectories of the differing reformations. Uh, there's a Lutheran theologian, Paul Hinlicky, and he makes the observation that what makes the Lutheran and the Reformed reformations different is their understanding of idolatry, fundamentally. So, the problem they have in the late medieval church is they feel that there's a lot of idolatry in the late medieval church, but how they evaluate it is really, really different. For Luther, the problem is that the late medieval church doesn't give you certainty about um, salvation. Okay, so and then gives you, and then tries to set up other things other than Christ to kind of give you that kind of certainty, right? So that's his problem with relics and the cult of the saints and all this kind of thing, and then the penitential system. And so the solution for Luther then is to God to make himself really sort of trustworthy, right? So that you have assurance of your salvation, which will then break your addiction to things that aren't God, right? So then that means God becomes more tangible. So it means not getting rid of sacramentalism, but becoming like hyper sacramental. In fact, a lot of Luther's discussions in terms of the doctrine of creation sound quite almost panentheistic at certain points. If you read the Genesis commentary, it talks about how all the creatures are God's masks and how he's promised to channel his goodness through them and how you can rely on that, and so forth. And he talks about this in the way the sacraments and also Christ. So you can really cling to Christ and you can really cling to the sacraments because God is really deep in the flesh, and you can have real assurance because God has made himself like your object, basically, that you can cling to. For the Reformed tradition, the problem is that humans confuse the glory of the eternal God with something created. Okay. And so the trajectory then becomes kind of the opposite. Okay. We'll get rid of as many creative things that are cluttering up your relationship with God, essentially, dragging God down to the level of a creature. For Luther, God wants to be at the level through present with you through creatures. He says the problem, that's actually how he evaluates sin. He says God wanted, he's talking about Adam in the Garden of Eden being promised to eat from all the trees of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he said, well, God at that point wanted to be present to us through the peach, right? But that wasn't good enough for us. So we wanted things that are spiritual. We wanted to move beyond creation and go to the real spiritual realm and interact with God directly. But for the Reform, that's precisely what you want to do at a certain level, because again, you don't want to confuse God as you don't want to confuse God with these temporal idols. So when Calvin talks about superstition, or idolatry, he talks about superstitious worship. That's his big thing, right? And that's also, of course, why they historically made the prohibition against images in the Ten Commandments a separate commandment. That's actually had the Orthodox, I believe, a number of them, but Lutherans kept the Roman Catholic numbering and just made essentially, worship of images or something like that, an instance of idolatry, maybe the one most prevalent in the ancient Near East or something like that. But, didn't consider it binding in the sense that you couldn't make church artwork or that you wouldn't even find that you wouldn't find God in physical things. And that's really what Zwingli is, when he's arguing with Luther, is really worried about. He's worried about superstitious worship. He whitewashed all the churches. He got rid of all the organs so that they would just sit and listen to his sermons for 3 hours at a time, and so that they would mentally ascend to God in the form of pure worship. So yeah, it's again a very, very different trajectory in terms of their understanding of idolatry, which I think does connect with the image issue.
Okay, I'm gonna go through the chat and see if there's any questions we got in here for you. Okay, there's a question about Lutheran soteriology. Are you okay with taking questions about? Okay.
Sure.
So Ivan asks, I have a question. if we're already saved by faith and our actions have no sense, there's no spiritual battle to do, right? Or am I wrong?
I mean, you still have a sinful nature, and you glorify God and show gratitude for the salvation you've been given by not succumbing to your sinful nature. In fact, it would really run contrary to faith itself, because faith is trusting in everything that God has said. And if he says that sinful things are not good for you, then you can't exactly say, well, I guess I trust you on the whole salvation thing, but telling me that adultery and murder and so forth are not good for me, yeah, I'm pretty skeptical about those. So I mean, actually, so faith itself, as Luther says, is the fulfillment of the law. So when you obey God, you're expressing your faith, because faith is trust that God wishes the best for you. Okay, particularly in offering salvation to you in Jesus. And the Ten Commandments are just a list of things that are not good for you. So you can take them as a set of rules that you have to try to achieve, or you can see them as a promise about the things that God is promising you are not good for you and that he wishes your good. And if you trust that those are not good for you, then you will strive to obey those commandments. So as an expression of your faith.
And this gets us deeper into questions over the differences between Reformed and Lutherans, and then Catholics and Orthodox and everybody when it comes to the usage of the law itself.
Right, sure.
Okay, so, did you? I don't remember this part. Did you call somebody numbnuts?
I did not.
Yes, I didn't hear that. Maybe it's you cut out a few parts and gobbled a little bit. Maybe they thought that.
Okay, so sorry. No.
He did not. So this is related. So how likely, if at all, does Dr. Kilcrease believe salvation to be for Nestorians, Eutychians, and Neoapollinarians?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would speculate on other people's salvation. I will say this: as in my denominational tradition, the Missouri Synod, we talk about something called a happy inconsistency or felicitous inconsistency. So, so that people can have the essence of their faith right and then get certain things wrong. And I hope that there is an element of felicitous inconsistency, that on some level, that even though they may have errors in certain points of their understanding of the person of Christ, that in fact they really do have a living relationship with Christ, and that they will be saved. But I don't know that I'm going to speculate necessarily. I would say this: I wouldn't have fellowship with them, so we would not be communing together. So because we don't agree about fundamental Christian doctrine. So that's all I can say about it.
So Elijah, and he's coming from a Catholic background, but did the other early reformers, and he puts that in quotations because he comes from a Catholic background,
Sure,
hold to different Christologies than Luther?
Yes, like Calvin and Zwingli did not agree with Luther's view that the divine nature communicates itself to the human nature, so that that's one of the reasons they rejected the Eucharistic presence, because they believed that Christ's humanity can only be in one place at one time. So yes, though they both agreed with him on that there were two natures in one person and all that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So do you have anything else you would like to leave our listeners with?
No, I really appreciate being asked to come on and talk about one of my favorite subjects, and it's a very good and I think productive and respectful discussion. So I was very pleased that you invited me. So thanks a lot.
And what was the name of your book on Christology?
The Self-Donation of God.
Yes, I have that in Kindle. So
Okay,
Self-Donation
right.
of God, if you guys would like that, I'll remember to put that in the description of this video below. And I will talk to you guys later, and have a nice night.